4 people had walked off that job in 3 weeks. The first lasted 2 days, the second lasted 6 hours, the third left a voicemail that his lawyer had advised him not to return, and the fourth, a man with 20 years in renovation work who had finished bathrooms in 3 different Portland hotels, left a note under the door of the Penthouse that said simply, "Not worth it." Then a single father with 11 days of rent left in his account knocked on that door, not because he thought he could handle whatever was inside, but because his daughter needed new shoes before school started, and he was not the kind of man who let his daughter wear shoes with holes in them. What he found inside that penthouse, inside the woman who had been refusing to let anyone stay, would take both of them somewhere neither of them could have reached alone. If this one's already pulling you in, tap like and tell me what city you're watching from. Portland, Oregon, September. The kind of late summer morning that still believed it was August. Nate Carver had learned to read job listings the way some people read weather, looking for the signs that told you what you were actually walking into versus what the listing said. This one said, "Finish carpentry and interior repair, penthouse unit, Meridian Tower, flexible timeline, immediate start, competitive rate." The rate was not what he would have called competitive. It was what he would have called desperate. High enough that 3 separate contractors he knew had called him in the past week to mention they'd passed on it and wondered if he was aware of it, which was the contracting world's version of a warning. He took it anyway. He took it because Wren's shoes had a hole in the left toe, and she'd been putting a piece of cardboard inside to keep the wet out. And he'd found the cardboard last Tuesday folded carefully in the bottom of her backpack, which meant she'd been doing it for longer than he knew. He took it because 11 days ago he'd sat at the kitchen table after Wren was asleep and put every number he had on a piece of paper, and the piece of paper had told him something he'd been telling himself wasn't true. He took it because Daniela had been gone 14 months, and he was still learning what that meant in practical terms. In the first months, it meant paperwork and arrangements. In the months after that, it meant learning which groceries Wren liked and which she'd only eaten because Daniela had made them. It meant parent-teacher conferences alone and dental appointments alone, and the specific particular weight of being in a room where both chairs were pulled up to the table and only one of them was his. 14 months. He was learning that grief did not thin the way people suggested. It changed shape. It found new rooms. He pressed the intercom button at 8:12 on a Wednesday morning. The response came after 45 seconds. A woman's voice, clipped and careful. The voice of someone who had decided something about him before she heard anything. "You're early." He checked his phone. My appointment was 8:15. It's 8:12. A silence. The door buzzed. The building's lobby had the quality of ambition slightly past its peak, beautiful bones, marble and steel, but a fountain in the center that hadn't been running, and the particular smell of a place that had stopped being maintained the way it was meant to be. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. He had a moment, standing in it on the way up, to review what he knew. The penthouse belonged to Sienna Voss. She'd owned it for 4 years. He'd found 3 articles about her in 30 minutes of searching the previous night. A profile from 5 years ago when her materials company, Voss and Hale, had won a regional innovation award. A trade press piece from 2 years ago about the company's patented composite material finding use in commercial architecture. And a third piece, much shorter, from 8 months ago, about a boardroom dispute and Sienna Voss's departure from the company she'd co-founded. The third piece was careful in the way legal situations made journalists careful, saying little and implying more. He also knew the penthouse had sustained significant damage from a water intrusion the previous winter. A pipe failure in the mechanical room above that had been addressed structurally but not cosmetically. Water damage behind drywall, warped flooring in 2 rooms, a section of the east wing ceiling that had partially come down and been shored up but not replaced. 4 contractors had assessed and started and left. The elevator opened. The penthouse was large and broken and flooded with the gray September light that came in off the river through floor-to-ceiling windows. The floors were original hardwood in the west section, warped and lifted in the east section where the water had come through. A temporary wall of plastic sheeting divided the apartment. The sealed-off section behind it, visible through one gap where the plastic had come loose, damaged ceiling, exposed joists. the particular honesty of a building with its skin pulled back. She was at a drafting table in the west section. Not the kind of drafting table that was decorative. A working one, papers spread across it, a large format printer humming against the wall behind her. She had her back to him when he came in. She turned when she heard his footsteps. Sienna Voss was 36, with the kind of dark eyes that registered everything and gave back very little. She was dressed as someone who had gotten dressed out of habit, rather than intention, clean clothes, hair pulled back, nothing to suggest she cared what he thought of her appearance. She didn't stand when he came in. She studied him the way he studied a wall before he opened it, looking for what was behind it before she committed to the work. "You assess the job remotely," she said. I reviewed the photos and the structural report. He set his bag down near the door. "I'll need to walk the damage before I can give you a firm timeline." The other said 2 to 3 weeks. She turned back to her papers. They all left before the end of week 1. "Any of them tell you why?" She picked up a pencil, made a notation on something he couldn't see. Various reasons. He looked around the space. At the drafting table, the papers, the large format printer that was clearly in daily use. At the kitchen beyond, functional, lived in. At the hallway that led toward the undamaged bedrooms, and, at the far end, toward the sealed east wing. In the middle of the hallway, being used as a doorstop to keep a door from swinging into a wall, was a rolled architectural tube, the kind used to store large drawings. It was closed at both ends, rubber banded. It looked like it had been there a while. He walked through the apartment without asking permission, which was the only way to do a proper assessment. He heard her go still at the drafting table when he moved toward the east wing. "I can't go back there yet," she said. He stopped. "The shoring," she clarified. "The ceiling is reinforced, but I don't know what the weight tolerance is on the. I can tell you in about 90 seconds. He moved the plastic sheeting aside and walked in. He had the flashlight from his bag. He spent 4 minutes in the east wing, moving carefully, testing the shoring work with his hands, reading the ceiling joists the way a carpenter reads them, in the grain, in the sound, in the particular give or resistance that told you what you were working with. He came back out. The ceiling shoring is solid. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. He gestured at the plastic. The plastic barrier is not sealed at the baseboard. Moisture is moving between the two sections. That needs addressing before cosmetic work makes sense. She was watching him from the drafting table. "What's your timeline?" he asked. "I need it livable before the 1st of November. A pause, the kind that held something unspoken. "I have a meeting with an attorney on the 1st. I need this space to look like someone intends to keep it." He looked at the scope of work. It was significant, but not impossible. 3 weeks if the subfloor is sound. 4 if it isn't. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, the way someone nods when they've decided to stop interviewing you and see what you do instead. The keys on the kitchen counter. She turned back to her work. "I'll be here most days." That was the first day. Nate drove home at 6. He stopped at the grocery store and bought the ingredients for the pasta Ren had asked for 3 times this week, and which he had kept deferring. He made it. He listened to her talk about school, a presentation she'd given about migratory patterns in birds, which had apparently produced a disagreement with her teacher about which species stopped in Oregon, and which Ren had resolved by citing a library book from home that she'd had the foresight to bring. He washed the dishes. He put her to bed. He sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes before he got up to go to sleep. He thought about the penthouse, about the way she'd registered the quality of his assessment, not the time it took or the conclusions, but the method. He thought about the coffee left on the counter near her table, which she had drunk without acknowledging. He thought about the blueprint tube. He had been in enough spaces to know when someone was protecting something. The tube was in plain sight and had been there long enough to be used as a doorstop, its original cap still on, rubber banded shut. That was not the behavior of someone who didn't care about the object. That was the behavior of someone who had decided not to do the thing the object required and had left it where they could see it every day without doing it. He'd had objects like that. After Daniela died, her reading glasses had sat on the nightstand for 4 months before he'd moved them. Not because he didn't know what they were or what moving them would mean, because moving them was a decision, and not all decisions were ready to be made on a calendar. He went to sleep. He had called his mother that week to talk through the finances, not in detail. Not in the way that would have worried her, but enough to hear someone say, "You'll figure it out, Nate." His mother said that with the calm of someone who had watched him figure things out for 33 years and had arrived at confidence through observation rather than faith. He appreciated the distinction. He had been, for 14 months, the person that everyone around him needed him to be. His mother needed him to be managing. Ren needed him to be present and unafraid. His clients needed him to be competent and on time. He had been all of these things. He had found, in the discipline of showing up that way, a kind of structure that held him in lieu of the structure Daniela had provided, simply by being there. He thought, on the drive to the penthouse the second morning, about what Daniela had understood about him that he had not fully understood about himself, that he needed work that asked something real of him. She had said once, when he was considering a job that was easier and higher paying, that he would be bored in a month, and he knew it. He had argued. She had been right. The penthouse was asking something real of him. He came back the next morning at 7, and Sienna was already at her table. She didn't acknowledge him when he came in. He made coffee in her kitchen, because he'd noticed the day before that she had decent coffee in a machine she clearly used, and he poured a cup and left one on the counter near the drafting table without saying anything, and went to work on the subfloor. She drank it. She didn't say thank you, but she drank it, and he noticed. The work in the east wing was harder than it looked from outside. The water intrusion had tracked further through the subfloor than the initial report suggested, and there was a section behind the east bedroom wall where the moisture had gotten into the framing. Not rot yet, he caught it early, but the kind of soft, compromised fiber that would become rot if he finished over it without addressing it first. He tore it back and let her see it. He knocked on the doorframe of the east bedroom. She came and looked at what he'd opened up. "This would have been under the new drywall in a week if the contractors before me had kept the original schedule," he said. "You wouldn't have found it until you had actual rot." She looked at the exposed framing, at the discolored fiber. She knew how to look at a building, he could tell by the way she assessed it, methodically without the anxiety of a layperson confronting unexpected damage. She understood what she was seeing. "How long to address it properly?" she asked. 3 additional days. "I'll bring the timeline back with better work on the subfloor end." She nodded. She went back to her drafting table. The days found a pattern. He arrived at 7. She was always there before him. He made coffee and left a cup at the end of her table and went to work. Around 10, she would occasionally ask him something. About the work, what he was encountering, what the next phase required. The questions were always precise. She never asked questions she could answer herself, and she always understood the answers without his having to explain them twice. By the end of the first week, he had established several things about Sienna Voss that were not in any article or public record. She ate at irregular hours. Sometimes a lunch she'd assembled at the kitchen counter while reviewing something on a tablet. More often skipping it entirely until he saw the particular quality of distraction that meant she'd gone too long without food and left something visible in the kitchen. She registered this without comment, but she ate it. She worked in 2 modes. The first was a focused drafting mode where she was almost completely still except her right hand, and the room had a quality of concentration he recognized from Daniela's best hours of work. The second was a reviewing mode where she moved around the apartment with papers, stopping to look at something from a different angle, occasionally standing at the east wing windows, the undamaged section, and looking out at the river. In the reviewing mode, she was more likely to speak. In the drafting mode, it was better to leave questions for later. She was precise about time. If she said a call was at 2, she was seated and ready by 1:50. If she said she needed something by Thursday, she needed it by Thursday, not Thursday evening, by Thursday. He had learned this the hard way on day 4, when he'd said he'd have a supply estimate to her by end of day, and had sent it at 5:45, and she had replied at 5:46, with a note that said she would have needed it by 5 if she'd known it was going to be end of day, and that end of day and by 5 were not the same thing. He updated his vocabulary for what end of day meant in this particular workspace. She had no one who called, no one who dropped by. Mrs. Polson in the lobby knew her. He heard her name spoken with a kind of careful warmth when he passed through, But the building staff moved around her with the practiced discretion of people who had been instructed not to be present when not needed. The penthouse had been, before the water intrusion, the kind of space that hosted dinners and meetings. There were chairs that hadn't been sat in for months, and a dining table that currently held stacks of documents organized in a system only she could read. Whatever her life had been before Marcus Hale, she'd been living this one alone. The work progressed. The subfloor replacement in the east wing was 3 days of precise, satisfying work, pulling the warped sections, checking the framing beneath, setting the new material in a pattern that would align with the existing west section. He worked with the radio off, which was unusual for him. He'd worked with music since he was 23, and his father had given him his first real toolkit. Here the silence felt right. She worked in it. He worked in it. The apartment held them both. On the 7th day, he found something that wasn't in the structural report. Behind the east bedroom wall, where the water had tracked further than documented, there was a section of framing with compromised fiber, not wrought yet, but the beginning of it. The particular softness that a good carpenter recognized before it became a problem, because once it became a problem, it was too late to not be a problem. He tore it back with the care it required. He photographed it. He set the photos on Sienna's table at the end of the day without saying anything about them. The next morning, she looked at them before she said anything else. She said, "The contractor before you had his crew do a remediation pass. They missed this?" He said, "Either they missed it or they covered it over." She looked at the photos. Her expression did the particular thing it did when she was absorbing something difficult. Very still. Nothing shown. The processing happening somewhere he couldn't see. She said, "How much time does addressing it add?" He told her. She said, "Do it." She went back to her table. He addressed it. He spent 3 days on the framing before the wall went back. He brought the section to full structural sound, better than it had been before the water came through, because the opportunity existed to make it right, and he was the kind of person who made things right when the opportunity existed. She tested him in week 2. He didn't realize until afterward that it was a test. At the time, it felt like what it appeared to be, an unreasonable demand delivered without apology. She sent him for a specific material from a supplier she'd used previously, without checking first whether the supplier still stocked it, and when he returned without it because the supplier had discontinued the line 6 months ago. She had a comment ready about his failure to call ahead. He did not point out that she had not told him to call ahead. He did not point out that she had sent him to a supplier without first confirming the material was available. He said, "I found a comparable material at a different supplier. Better spec. Same price. I can get it tomorrow if you approve the source." She studied the alternative spec for 30 seconds. She approved it. 2 days later, she sent him a written correction for a measurement he'd called out verbally in a conversation that morning. She had written it down differently than he'd said it, and the written version was wrong, and when she called it a discrepancy, he'd introduced. He quietly retrieved the original conversation by way of the materials order he'd placed at the measurement she had said, which matched what he'd called out and not what she'd written. He brought her the order confirmation. He set it on the table. He said, "The order matches what I calculated." She looked at it. She said, "The notation is wrong in my records." He said, "Yes." She said nothing more. She corrected her records. He went back to work. He understood what was happening. Not consciously, not in any systematic way. He simply recognized the pattern from other work he'd done in rooms with other people who had learned to keep a certain kind of distance from everyone who came in and out. He'd seen it in buildings before, the structure that resisted every new load, not because it was weak, but because it had been stressed before, and the stress had left it cautious. He was not going to let it drive him out. Not because he was certain what was on the other side of the caution. He didn't know yet. And he didn't need to know yet. But because the job was worth doing, and the apartment deserved to be made right, and he was the person who had agreed to do it. He showed up every morning. He made the coffee. He did the work. On the 12th day, she turned the drawings on her table face up. He had not seen them fully until that point. They'd been visible in glimpses. She worked at a drafting table that faced the window, not the room, and what he'd caught from the hallway angle was partial. But when he passed through to check the East Wing access on a Tuesday afternoon, the table was turned slightly, and the drawings were face up, and he could see them properly. They were material specifications, the kind that lived at the intersection of engineering and design, structural behavior and architectural applications. The specificity of them was remarkable. He looked long enough to understand what he was looking at, and then he went to work and didn't mention it. She said, 2 hours later, "You keep looking at the drawings." He was in the hallway installing a door threshold. He turned off the sander. He said, "I spent 10 minutes with a father who was a structural engineer before I decided I wanted to work with my hands. Those specifications are unusually specific for residential application." She said, "They're not for residential application." He waited. She said nothing more. She turned back to the window. He turned the sander back on. But the drawings stayed face up. On the fourth day, she said, without looking up from her table, "You keep looking at the drawings." He had been. The work spread across her drafting table was visible from the hallway when the east bedroom door was open, and he moved between sections. The drawings were complex, architectural material specifications, the kind that sat at the intersection of design and engineering. "Sorry," he said. "You're not sorry." She made a notation. "What are you looking at specifically?" "The composite specs." He paused. "The material density variations in those load panels are unusually fine-grained. I've never seen tolerances that tight specified in a residential application." She looked up. "You can read those drawings." "My father was a structural engineer. I grew up on site with him before I figured out I wanted to make things with my hands rather than calculate them." She looked at the drawings, then at him. Then she turned them over. That was Friday. By Monday morning, she had turned them back. He didn't say anything. He just noticed, the way he noticed everything in a space he was working in. She worked at her table with a focused intensity that was its own kind of wall. Not unfriendliness exactly, something more like concentration taken to an absolute. She was working on something she didn't explain and he didn't ask about. And the hours moved around them both with the particular quality of two people sharing a space without demanding anything from each other. On Thursday of the second week, she said, "You have a child." He was running a belt sander along a section of the replaced subfloor, and he turned it off. A daughter, 7 years old. She was looking at the pencil in her hand, not at him. "You don't bring her here. She's in school. But the contractors before you, 2 of them mentioned flexible schedules, being able to bring their children to jobs." He thought about this. It hadn't occurred to him. He'd been treating this job like a job that required his best professional presentation, which meant showing up alone, on time, with his tools in order. "She'd come if I brought her," he said. "But the East Wing, the shoring situation, I didn't want her around that until it was stable. The ceiling has been reinforced," she said. "The structural engineer cleared it 2 weeks ago." She turned back to her drawing. "If it's ever relevant." He looked at her profile. At the careful way she was holding the pencil, a slight tension in her fingers that he was learning to read the way you learn to read a structure. In the details. In the things that didn't show unless you were paying attention. He went back to the sanding. The third week the work was better, the subfloor replaced, the framing treated and rebuilt, the east wing beginning to look like something a person might inhabit rather than an injury site. He was sourcing the drywall for the ceiling replacement when his phone rang. Wren's school. He answered it. He was out the door in 6 minutes. He had not said goodbye because Sienna was on a call of her own in the bedroom she used as an office, and he hadn't wanted to interrupt. When he came back the next morning, she was at her table. "Is your daughter all right?" He looked at her. She hadn't moved. She had been apparently tracking his absence. She had a fall at recess. Nothing broken. He set his bag down. "Sorry I left without saying." "Is that why the others left?" she asked. He understood what she meant. She meant, is that why they gave up? Because I was difficult? Or were their reasons legitimate? "No," he said. The first one was on a timeline he didn't communicate and decided halfway through that he couldn't meet it. The second wanted a different scope than what the work actually required. The third, he paused, left the voicemail I know about. I don't know about the note. She looked at him. You did research. You had 4 contractors leave in 3 weeks. I needed to know what I was walking into before I committed. Most people ask me. He looked at her steadily. You don't seem like a person who gives away information she hasn't decided to share. A silence. Something moved across her face and then was gone. She turned back to her drawings. He went to work. On a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week, he was working with the existing drawings she'd given him for the ceiling replacement when he realized the load distribution notes didn't account for the mechanical room above correctly. The previous structural engineer's plans had missed a moment connection detail that would matter if the penthouse ever went back to a heavier ceiling installation. He knocked on the doorframe of her office. She looked up. He showed her the discrepancy. She studied it for 30 seconds, then stood. She was taller than he'd realized. She always sat at her table, and came to look at the drawing in his hand. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, completely, taking the whole thing in before she said a word. He worked out a correction before the ceiling goes up, he said. It won't change the visual outcome, but it'll matter in the long run. She was still looking at the drawing. Her eyes moved between his notation and the original specification. You're right, she said. She said it simply, the way someone says a thing they're accustomed to not having to qualify. She took the drawing from him, made a notation of her own in her own pencil, handed it back. Use this dimension instead. It accounts for the live load variance. He looked at her notation. It was correct. More correct than his correction, actually. She'd extended the fix to a secondary connection he'd noticed, but not addressed. Thank you, he said. She went back to her office. He stood in the hallway for a moment, with the drawing in his hand, looking at her handwriting in the margin. The load panel specifications on her drafting table. The blueprint tube standing against the wall, still serving as a doorstop, still banded shut. He picked up the tube and set it upright against the wall more carefully, so it wouldn't roll. That was when she came back into the hallway. She stopped when she saw him holding it. He set it down against the wall. Sorry, he said. It was about to roll. She looked at the tube, then at him. She didn't say anything. She went back to her office and closed the door, and he heard, for a moment, something that might have been a long breath. He went back to work. He didn't tell Wren much about the job. He told her it was a big apartment downtown, which was true, and that the woman who lived there was quiet, which was also true. He said the work was interesting and the place had good bones, which was the thing he always said when he was in a building that deserved better than what had happened to it. Wren asked if there were birds outside the windows. He said there was a river. She said that was better than birds. He hadn't expected her to say that. And it made him smile the way she still made him smile, in the specific involuntary way that meant she'd surprised him again. Daniela had done that, surprised him. He had thought at some point after Daniela died that he would stop being surprised by things, and then Wren had kept on being Wren, which was its own argument against that. He thought about the job on the drive home, about Sienna's handwriting in the margin of the drawing, about the blueprint tube. He'd been in enough spaces to know when someone was protecting something. The tube was in plain sight, and had been there long enough to function as a doorstop, and she'd never moved it herself even though it was clearly in the way. That was not the behavior of someone who didn't care about the object. That was the behavior of someone who had decided not to move it for a reason they hadn't worked out yet. He went home. He made dinner. He helped Wren with a school project that required, for reasons that were not immediately evident, significant amounts of blue construction paper. He thought about Sienna Voss's drawings turned face up on the table after the weekend. He went to sleep. The setback came on a Thursday. It came in the form of a ceiling joist in the east wing that had been misrepresented in the shoring documentation. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong in a specific technical way that meant the support pattern wasn't what the original structural report had claimed. He was up on a work platform checking the attachment points when the secondary brace shifted. It didn't collapse. The shoring held. But he came down hard on his right wrist when he caught himself on the scaffolding, and he knew before he'd finished the motion that something had given. He sat on the floor of the east wing and looked at his hand for a moment. His wrist was swelling already. Sienna was at the hallway entrance within 10 seconds. She had heard it, the shift in the shoring, the controlled drop. She looked at his wrist, then at the ceiling. Her face went very still, and the way he was learning meant she was processing something at a level below what showed. "You need ice and an X-ray," she said. "It's probably not broken. It's probably sprained at minimum." Her voice was even and controlled. "Do you want to drive, or should I call someone?" "I can drive." He stood. He didn't have the freedom to not drive. Ren would need picking up at 3. She got ice from the kitchen without being asked, brought it back in a dish towel, held it out to him. He wrapped it around his wrist. "Who was the structural engineer who signed off on this section?" he asked. A pause. Her voice, when she answered, had shifted slightly. Her previous contractor's structural consultant. Not the original engineer of record. He looked at the ceiling, at the brace that had shifted. "That documentation doesn't match what I found up there." "I know." She looked at the floor. "I didn't see it until you were already up." He absorbed this. She had seen it, or had suspected something, and had not said so before he got on the platform. He looked at her face and saw that she knew he understood this, and was waiting for the outcome. "How long did you know?" he asked. He kept his voice level, not accusatory, just the question. "I suspected 2 days ago." The notation in the original report uses a lateral load assumption that doesn't match the mechanical room specs. "I was verifying before I said anything." He nodded. He should have been checking it himself. He had been checking it, but not fast enough. "I'll have the correct documentation by this afternoon," she said. She looked at his wrist. "I'm sorry." He wrapped the dish towel tighter. "These things happen. I should have been checking the secondary braces independently. This is my fault." He looked at her. It was a genuinely difficult thing for her to say. He could see that. Not because she was defensive, but because she had been holding herself very carefully for a long time, and this was a place where that control had failed to prevent something. "We both missed it," he said. He moved toward the door. "I'll be back in the afternoon once I know what the damage is." He was not back that afternoon. The wrist was not broken, but it was a significant sprain with ligament involvement, and the hand specialist he saw at the urgent care said 2 weeks minimum before he could resume heavy work. He sat in the parking lot of the urgent care facility and looked at the bandaged wrist and did the numbers in his head. 2 weeks was a third of his timeline, a third of his remaining income before November. He called Sienna. She answered on the second ring. "Grade 2 sprain," he said. "Ligament involvement. 2 weeks before heavy work." A silence. "Then I'll pay you for the 2 weeks regardless." He started to say that wasn't what he was calling about, and then realized he didn't have a clean argument for why not. "I'll keep the administrative work moving," he said. "The materials sourcing, the order coordination. I'll be less useful without the hands, but I'm not walking away from the job." Another silence. This one had a different quality. "All right," she said. He drove to pick up Ren. The insurance adjuster issue came 3 days later. He learned about it when he arrived at 8 and found Sienna at her table with a letter, reading it with the flat expression she wore when something had gone badly, but she wasn't ready to say so. He waited. She said, "Without turning, the building's insurance carrier is questioning the ownership status of the unit. There's a clause related to the water damage claim that requires proof of unencumbered ownership." He understood the shape of this. "The legal situation. Is there a dispute about ownership?" he asked. She set the letter down. "My former business partner filed a civil claim 7 months ago asserting that the penthouse was purchased with commingled business funds and therefore represents a business asset subject to dispute. The claim has no legal merit. The unit was purchased 3 years before our partnership dissolved, entirely with my own funds. But the filing creates a," she paused, selecting the word, "a cloud on the title while the claim is active. And the insurance carrier is using the cloud to slow the claim." Yes, he sat down at the kitchen table, which he'd never done before. He'd always stood or worked. But this felt like a conversation that required sitting. She turned in her chair to face him. It was the first time in 3 weeks that they'd been facing each other without something functional between them. A drawing, a problem, the work. "He is Marcus Hale," she said. "My former co-founder. We started Voss and Hale 12 years ago. The materials patents," she gestured toward the drafting table, toward the drawings, "are mine. They were my research, my formulations, my IP before the company existed. I brought them into the partnership. He brought the capital. He nodded. He was listening. He understood she was telling him something she had not told the contractors before him. 18 months ago, my mother became ill. I was in Portland, she was in Chicago, and I traveled back and forth for 7 months. She died in March. She said it plainly, the way Nate said things that were simply true and simply terrible. While I was traveling, Marcus restructured the company's board. He brought in 2 new members without my knowledge and voted through a change to the IP licensing structure that effectively transferred my patents to the company rather than maintaining them as my contributions to the company. The distinction is legal and significant. He waited. I had an attorney who should have caught it, she said. I had oversight I should have maintained. I was in a hospital in Chicago, and I let things move without me, and Marcus knew I would. He waited until I couldn't be in the room. She was very still when she said this. Not emotional, past the immediate emotion of it. In the place you got to after you'd sat with something long enough that the grief had clarified into something harder and more precise. My leaving the company is technically a resignation, she said. In practice, it was made impossible for me to stay. He had the board, the restructured licensing, the capital relationships. I had the penthouse, and what remained of my cash accounts in the original research files. The blueprint tube, he thought. I'm suing to recover the IP rights, she said. The case depends on establishing that the pre-partnership patents belong to me personally, not to the company. That requires documentation. She looked at the drafting table. The original research drawings. The development chronology. I've been rebuilding the record. That's what you've been working on, he said. For 7 months. He looked at the table, at the stacks of papers, at the large format printer, at the amount of work that had accumulated there. He thought about Marcus Hale for a moment. He did not know the man. He knew the shape of what he'd done. Had watched enough buildings go wrong to know that structural failures rarely came from malice. They came from ambition that stopped short of honesty about its own limits. From someone who had worked hard and decided that working hard entitled them to what they hadn't built. He believed in the work, Nate said. Your former partner. She looked at him. He said, I'm not defending him. I'm saying he believed he was the real architect of what you built together. He wasn't wrong that he'd worked hard. He was wrong about what that entitled him to. She was quiet for a moment. She said, yes, that's exactly what happened. She said it with the kind of exhaustion that came from having turned a thing over so many times you knew every side of it. He told me once, early in the partnership, that he'd given me the capital I needed to become what I was. He said it like a gift. I should have heard it differently. He looked at the table. He looked at the hallway, at the blueprint tube. He said, Can I ask you what's in the tube? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the original patent applications, the material specifications, predating the company. She looked at the tube. I haven't opened it since the week after Marcus changed the board structure. She paused. I'm afraid of what I'm going to find. She said it flatly, in the way she said things that cost her something. Either the documentation is complete enough to support the case, in which case I should have filed sooner, or it isn't, in which case I've been living in a damaged apartment for 7 months, building towards something that won't hold. He looked at her. She had told him this because the insurance situation had forced the context, because she had been holding all of it very carefully in a space that had no room for one more problem, because he had sat down at her kitchen table. I have a friend, he said, who handles property title disputes. Not the same as IP, but he knows who to call. I can get you a name for the insurance problem. She nodded. She looked at the tube. You should open it, he said. Whatever's in there, you should know. She looked at him with the dark eyes that gave nothing back. Not yet, she said, but she stood up and walked to the hallway and picked up the tube and carried it to her desk. That was where it stayed. The title insurance problem took 3 weeks to move through the right channels. His contact connected Sienna to an attorney who specialized in title encumbrances and who had apparently seen Marcus Hale's playbook before, not Marcus specifically, but the category of filing that was designed not to prevail on its merits, but to create operational friction. The attorney filed a motion to dismiss the ownership claim as frivolous on its face, and while the full resolution would take time, the insurance carrier, presented with a pending dismissal, accepted a conditional arrangement that allowed the water damage claim to proceed. He knew about this in pieces, Sienna mentioning a call, a notation in the progress she mentioned without elaborating. He had gotten used to understanding her situation in fragments she released without making a thing of releasing them. On a Wednesday afternoon during the 2-week recovery, he arrived at the Penthouse without hands-on work to do and spent 3 hours coordinating material deliveries and reviewing the ceiling replacement specifications from a chair at the kitchen table. She worked at her drafting table. The apartment was quiet, with the particular quality of 2 people who had stopped needing to make conversation to justify their shared presence. At 4, she said, "Your contractor friend." He looked up. She said, "The one who connected me to the title attorney." She set down her pencil. "Thank you." He said, "He owed me a referral." She said, "That's not what I'm thanking you for." He looked at her. He waited. She said, "I've been trying to manage this alone for 7 months. The case, the insurance, She stopped. She picked her pencil back up. "I thought managing it alone was the same as managing it competently. I'm less certain of that now." He said, "You were managing it alone because you'd been given a good reason not to trust the people around you." She looked at him. He said, "That's not the same as not being able to manage things with help." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to her drawing. He went back to the material schedule. The 2 weeks ended. His wrist was functional. He came back to the East Wing and the work resumed, and the apartment began to transform from a place that had been injured into something that was genuinely whole. She watched him work sometimes. Not continuously. She had her own work, and it commanded her full attention. But in the moments when she moved between the drafting table and the printer or the kitchen, she would slow near whatever he was doing and look at it with the same methodical assessment she gave to everything. He became aware of her awareness. That was the only way to say it. He had been in her orbit for 3 weeks, and he had learned her rhythms and her silences and the particular quality of her attention, and somewhere in those 3 weeks he had also learned the particular quality of her attention when it was on him. It was not different from how she attended to anything else. Complete, assessing, nothing hidden from it. But he knew it now, and knowing it was its own kind of thing. He did not say anything about it. He kept working. He was 3 days into the 2-week recovery when Wren came to the Penthouse. Sienna had asked, carefully and without much explanation, whether he would be coming by on Saturday to coordinate the materials delivery for the drywall. He had said he would. Wren had Saturday off from school. He had not arranged anything else. He'd asked Sienna the night before by text, "My daughter's with me this weekend. Is that workable?" The response had come 30 minutes later, yes. He hadn't been entirely sure what to expect. Wren at 7 was not a child who could be predicted with any confidence. She was observant and direct, and had strong opinions about spaces, having spent enough time in the buildings he worked in to have developed a vocabulary for them. She walked into the Penthouse with her backpack and her eyes wide. "It's very tall," she said. "The ceilings." Yes, she looked at the river through the windows. She looked at the work in the east section. The plastic barrier pulled back now that the shoring had been properly documented and certified. The new ceiling framing visible. She turned around. Sienna was at her drafting table. Wren walked directly toward her. He opened his mouth. Wren had not been introduced. Wren did not always wait for introductions. Wren stopped 2 feet from the drafting table and looked at the drawings spread across it. "These are buildings," she said. "Building materials," Sienna said. She did not appear alarmed by the direct approach. She was looking at Wren the way she looked at most things, fully, without anything held back. "What does this number mean?" Wren pointed at a density specification. "It tells engineers how much weight the material can hold." Wren processed this. Then she said, "You smell like the wood at Dad's workshop." She said it with calm certainty. "That's a good smell." Sienna was very still. Wren pulled her backpack around and retrieved a drawing she'd been working on, a section of the penthouse she'd apparently sketched while walking through it. She laid it on the corner of Sienna's drafting table, not on top of any papers. I drew the window, she said. The light comes in at an angle in the morning and makes a shape on the floor. Sienna looked at the drawing. She looked at it for a longer time than a 7-year-old's drawing usually commanded. You notice the angle, she said. It makes a triangle in the morning, Wren said. Isosceles, Sienna looked up. At Wren. Then briefly at Nate. You can leave it if you want, Sienna said. Wren nodded as though this was expected. She went to investigate the east wing. Nate watched Sienna look at the drawing. The way she looked at things when she thought no one was paying attention, with a kind of unguarded attention that had been waiting for permission. He went to coordinate the materials delivery. That afternoon, when he was reviewing the delivery schedule in the kitchen, he heard Wren's voice from the direction of Sienna's office. He went to the doorway and saw that Wren had settled on the floor near Sienna's desk, drawing. Sienna was working. Neither of them had apparently suggested this arrangement. It had simply happened. He went back to his work. At 4, when they were leaving, Wren said goodbye to Sienna in the same direct way she'd said hello. Sienna said goodbye. Then she said, the triangle on the floor, it shifts north by about 4 feet by noon. He heard something in her voice that he hadn't heard in 3 weeks of working in her space. Wren's face lit up with the focused pleasure she showed when someone gave her information she would find useful. I'll check that tomorrow, she said. We're not here tomorrow, Nate said. I mean next Saturday. He looked at Sienna. Sienna looked at her drawing. All right, she said. He drove home with Wren narrating the penthouse in detail in the back seat, and he thought about Sienna's voice when she'd said that. The Saturdays became something neither of them had named. Wren came every Saturday in October with her notebook. She was documenting the light, she explained to Nate once, with the seriousness of someone who had identified a research question and intended to answer it. The angle of incidence, the shift across the morning, the relationship between the east windows and the floor. She had a system. It involved pencil notes in the margin of the drawing page and a notation key she'd developed herself that he suspected was more precise than anything required for a second-grade science project. Sienna engaged her completely. He had not expected that, not the degree of it. Sienna had a specific patience with Wren's questions that was not the patient performance of an adult managing a child, but the actual patience of someone who found the questions genuinely interesting. When Wren asked why certain materials held more weight than others, Sienna explained it in terms that were precise and accurate and adjusted for what Wren could absorb without talking down to her. When Wren's notation system had a flaw, she was measuring the light angle wrong because she was measuring from the floor rather than from the window plane. Sienna corrected it the same way she corrected anything Nate did that was technically off, directly, without apology, with the better method offered immediately. Wren accepted this the way she accepted all information that was true and useful, completely and without drama. He watched them on the Saturday afternoons in the East Wing. The workspace Sienna had claimed once the repairs were advanced enough. Sienna at the work table she'd moved from the main room, Wren on the floor with her notebook. The conversation between them would go long stretches without words. Sienna working, Wren documenting, and then Wren would ask something, and Sienna would answer, and it would go quiet again. He understood that Wren was doing what Wren always did, which was be completely herself in a room with someone. She had not decided that Sienna required a different approach than anyone else. She had simply recognized that Sienna knew things and was willing to share them and was not going to waste her time. He understood also that Sienna had not been around a child in a long time, and that whatever Wren was doing to the carefully sealed space Sienna maintained, she was doing it by being entirely unaware that a sealed space existed. One Saturday in October, Nate was installing the last section of hardwood in the east bedroom when he heard Wren's voice from the main room. She said, "What happened to the apartment?" He stopped. Sienna said, "There was a water problem. Some of the structure was damaged." Wren said, "Is that why the man before my dad left?" A pause. Sienna said, "One of the reasons." Wren said, "Did the others leave because of you?" A longer pause. He set down the nail gun. Sienna said, "Mostly." Wren said, "My teacher left our class last year. She said it was for a different job, but everyone thought it was because the class was too much. She said it thoughtfully, not accusingly." Are you too much? He held his breath. Sienna said probably. Yes, Ren said, that's okay. Dad is too much too. She said it with the calm certainty she had about everything. He's very particular about how things are done, and he thinks about stuff for a long time without explaining it, and he works really early and really late, and he forgets to eat sometimes. Sienna said, Does that bother you? Ren considered. She said no, because he always comes back. Even when things are hard, he still comes back. He heard Sienna's silence. He picked up the nail gun and went back to work. That evening, driving home, Ren said, I told Sienna about you. He said, I know. I heard. She said, Is that okay? He said, Yes. She said, I told her you always come back. He said, That's true. She said, I thought she needed to know. He looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window at the city going dark. He said, You were right. The twin wounds came out in the same week. It happened in the way that things had been happening between them, not in a design conversation, but in the accumulation of shared space and the things that came loose when two people stopped managing themselves for each other's benefit. His came first. He was working in the east bedroom, the last bedroom, the one that had needed the most work, when Sienna came to the doorway. Not with a question. She stood there the way she stood when she was thinking, hands at her sides, eyes on the middle distance. She said, Your daughter mentioned her mother. He kept his hands moving on the baseboard he was fitting. He said, What did she say? She said that her mother was there and then she wasn't. She said it was before she could really remember, but that she remembers the before part being different from the after part. He said, She does remember that. She can't put words to it, but she knows. Sienna came into the room. She sat in the chair he'd positioned near the window for a measurement reference and looked at the floor. She said, How long? He said, 14 months. She was sick for 2 years before that. Heart failure. Slow, she looked at her hands. He said, We knew it was coming. That's its own kind of thing. You grieve while the person is still there. And then when they're gone, you've already been grieving so long, but the grief after is it's still entirely new. She said, My mother. It was 7 months of watching. And I kept telling myself I was managing it, keeping things moving, because that was what she needed from me, for me not to fall apart. She looked up. I fell apart later, when there was no more reason not to. He said, Yeah. She said, and that's when Marcus, she stopped. She started again. The timing was not accidental. He moved when I couldn't watch. He set down the baseboard. He looked at her. He said, You trusted him for 12 years. She said, I trusted him because we built something together that neither of us could have built alone. I thought that meant something permanent. He said, It meant something. It meant what it was. He said it carefully. It just didn't mean he wouldn't make a different choice when the opportunity came. She looked at him. He said, The grief and the betrayal are two separate things. They happened at the same time and they feel like one thing. But they're not. She was quiet. He picked up the baseboard again. He went back to fitting it. She sat in the chair by the window for another 10 minutes, watching him work. Not saying anything. He didn't need her to say anything. He knew what the silence was. Her wound came out the following Thursday. It came from a question he asked, a direct one, which he had been careful with until then, because he understood that direct questions from him landed differently on her than they would from someone she didn't have to see every day. He said, You've been here 7 months. You took the tube off the hallway floor, but you haven't opened it. She looked at the tube on her desk. He said, You're not afraid it's incomplete. You've been rebuilding the record for 7 months. You know more about what's in there now than you did when you closed it. She said nothing. He said, What are you actually afraid of? She was at the work table. She had a pencil in her hand. She set it down very deliberately. She said, That it won't be enough. He waited. She said, Not legally. She corrected herself. I'm not afraid it won't win the case. She looked at the table. I'm afraid that even if it wins, it won't be enough. That I'll have the patents back and I'll still be the person who lost them in the first place. He looked at her. She said, Marcus told me, when I found out what he'd done, he told me that I had built something valuable, but that I hadn't been willing to do what was necessary to protect it. He said the board restructure was a correction to an instability I'd introduced by leaving for my mother. He said, he was wrong. She said, he was wrong. And some part of me believed him. He said, you were sitting in a hospital with your mother and he was rewriting the ownership structure of the company you founded. He said it plainly. That's not an instability you introduced. That's someone using a window you didn't know needed locking. She looked at him. He said, you've been holding that for 7 months on top of grief that already had no room for another weight. She said, I'm very good at holding things. He said, I know. I've watched you hold things for 5 weeks. She was quiet. He said, Sienna. He said her name the way he'd learned to say it, without inflation, without softening. She heard the name differently when it was said that way, he'd noticed, like it was just the right size. Open the tube. She looked at the tube. She said, tonight. He said, tonight. He left her to it. She called him at 11 that night. He was awake. He had trouble sleeping before midnight, had since Daniela, the night hours the ones that still sometimes required management. He answered. She said, the documentation is complete. 3 years of development chronology. Original patent applications with filing dates. The pre-partnership research log with dated entries. She said it evenly, the way she said hard things. Everything my attorney needs. He said, good. She said, I should have opened it 6 months ago. He said, you opened it when you could. A pause. She said, I've been very alone here. For a very long time. He said, I know. She said, you've been? She stopped. She started again. I don't know how to say what you've been. He said, you don't have to. She said, I want to. He waited. She said, you stayed. Every day. You kept working. Even when the wrist made it difficult and the materials were wrong and the structural report was inaccurate. Even when she stopped. Even when I was not easy to be in the same room with. He said, you're not hard to be in a room with. You're precise. Those aren't the same thing. A long pause. She said, I'm going to file the motion this week, to start the case formally moving. He said, good. She said, thank you for asking about the tube. He said, thank you for answering. She said, good night. He said, good night. He lay awake for a while longer. He thought about her voice in the 11 o'clock dark, saying, I've been very alone here for a very long time. He thought about Daniela at the end, saying, you need to remember that you're allowed to want things after. He had thought he understood that when she said it. He was learning what it meant more slowly than she'd probably expected. The first real conversation was a Thursday evening in the 4th week, when the work was substantially complete and only the finishing remained. He'd stayed late to catch up on time lost to the sprain, and when he looked up from the trim he was setting around a new ceiling panel, the light in the penthouse had gone amber with the end of the day, and Sienna was at her table with the blueprint tube in front of her. Open this time. The rubber bands removed, the cap off, the drawings partially out. He didn't say anything. He went to the kitchen and made coffee and brought 2 cups to the drafting table, which he had stopped waiting to be told was acceptable to approach. She looked at the papers. The development chronology is complete, she said. 3 years of research logs before the company existed. Individual patent applications with filing dates. She said this like she was reading off a weather report, like the information was separate from the relief. Or the fear. That's what you needed? My attorney says it's sufficient to establish independent authorship. She set the papers down carefully. The case will still take time. But it's enough. He sat in the chair at the end of her table, the one that had been there since the first day, but that he'd never sat in. What happens when you win? He asked. When, she said, not if. He'd noticed she'd said when without qualifying it. She picked up her pencil. I refound Crestline materials. The IP is mine. The research is mine. The company name was the only part of Voss and Hale that actually belongs to him. He looked at the drawings on the table, at the density specifications, at the work she'd been doing for 7 months in a damaged apartment, rebuilding the record of everything Marcus Hale had claimed for himself. Why didn't you leave? He asked. When the company went wrong. Why stay in the penthouse? Because, she said. And then she stopped. She picked up the pencil again and set it back down. Because he built the case for keeping this from me partly on the argument that I was emotionally unfit to run the company after my mother died. She said it very flat. And leaving the penthouse, selling it, moving into something smaller and easier, that would have looked like he was right. Like I was collapsing. So you stayed, and you didn't finish the repairs. She looked at the plastic barrier, which was almost entirely down now. I stopped letting contractors in. I stopped letting anything feel temporary. I think I was afraid that if I let the apartment be under construction, it would be another argument for instability. A damaged place for a damaged person. He thought about that. He thought about the way she'd turned the drawings face up on his third Monday, about the tube at the end of the hallway that she'd carried to her desk but not opened for 7 months, about Ren saying you smell like the wood at my dad's workshop, which is a good smell. What changed? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the drawings. You kept working, she said. You fixed the framing even when it was harder than it was supposed to be. You said we both missed it about the ceiling joist when you could have said I created a dangerous condition and walked away. She said it carefully. You found the Hartman notation and fixed it without being asked. She paused. You stayed. He didn't say anything. She looked at him. The dark eyes that gave nothing back, giving something back now. Small, visible, like a door that's been locked a long time and is being opened slowly to check whether the hinge still works. I'm not good at this, she said, at being in proximity to people. It used to be easier. Before my mother, before Marcus. I had colleagues, a team, ways of being in a room with people. She put her hand flat on the papers. I've been alone in here for 7 months, and I didn't notice how much of myself I'd sealed off until your daughter walked in and said I smelled like something good. He looked at the drawing Ren had left on the corner of the table. The triangle of light on the floor. She trusted you immediately, he said. She trusts everyone. No, Sienna said. She looked at him. She doesn't. She trusts you, and she extended that to me. Those are different things. He thought about Daniela, about the last 2 years of her illness, the caregiving, the watching, about learning to be very still in a room with someone who was afraid, because stillness was the only useful thing. He said, I had 4 years of being the person my wife needed me to be while she was sick. You learn what presence is when someone needs you to be completely there and not bring any of your own noise into the room. She was listening. She died 14 months ago, he said. Heart failure, progressive. We knew it was coming for 2 years. He said it the way it had to be said, plainly, without the softening that made it bearable for other people but didn't actually help him. The hardest part wasn't the grief. The hardest part was learning to exist again as a person with my own needs. Not just a father, not just a caregiver, a person. She looked at him. He said, I think you sealed everything off for a good reason. I think what Marcus did was a real thing that deserved a real response. He looked at the drawings. But I think you also sealed off the part of yourself that knows those patents are worth fighting for. Not just legally. Worth fighting for, because you made them. She was very still. He said, the drawings that came back out on Monday, you turned them face up. She said nothing. He said, you were already opening the door before you were ready to. That's not instability. That's stubbornness. He said it without any softness. The only kind of stubbornness that works. She looked at him. He realized he'd said more than he'd planned to. He also realized he meant all of it. She said, I haven't had a person say something directly to me in a long time. He said, I'm a carpenter. We go straight. She almost smiled. It was brief and involuntary, and she controlled it before it became a real smile. But it had been there. She said, the coffee was good, by the way, from the first day. He said, I know. She looked at her papers. He looked at them too. He didn't leave at the usual time. The Crestline case moved. Not quickly, nothing in IP litigation moved quickly, but with the kind of steadiness that came from documentation that was unambiguous. He knew because Sienna began to talk about it, not with him sitting at her table with his full attention, but in the passing way of someone who was getting used to being heard. A sentence here about the discovery timeline. A correction she'd asked her attorney to push for in deposition scheduling. The name Marcus Hale said, with the kind of quiet that held 15 years of partnership and then its particular unraveling. He finished the east wing. He finished the ceiling, the floor, the trim. The plastic barrier came down on a Thursday afternoon in late October, and the penthouse was, not restored, not made new, made right again. The hardwood floors in the east section were replaced with wood he'd matched carefully to the existing west section. The ceiling was smooth and sealed. The light came through the east windows the way it was supposed to come through, hitting the floors with a particular angle that Wren had, in fact, documented on her Saturday visits through October, noting in a small notebook she'd brought for the purpose the slight shift northward as the season changed. He stood in the east wing on the last full workday. Sienna came and stood beside him. The light was good. She had papers in her hands. She almost always had papers in her hands, and she looked at the room and then at him. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, the way she'd come to say things with him, without the management she used with other people, without the careful framing. He said, "It's a good room." She looked at it. She said, "I'm going to put my worktable in here. Better light." He looked at the windows. She was right. He said, "The angle in the morning will hit the northwest corner. Best for drafting." She said, "I know." Wren mapped it. He almost smiled. She looked at him with the direct eyes that now gave things back. "The case," she said. "Preliminary finding came this morning. Independent authorship of the patents confirmed. Full adjudication pending, but the structural ruling is in my favor." She said it evenly. "It's going to hold." He said, "Good." She said, "Marcus is contesting the ruling. He will continue to contest it. He's going to make it expensive, and he's going to try to run out the clock." He said, "He won't." She looked at him. He said, "You've been rebuilding the record for 7 months in a damaged apartment, and you didn't move. You're not going to run out of something before he does." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about Crestline. The relaunch. The materials are sound. The research is more developed now than when Marcus restructured the board. I've been working through the development sequence, and there are significant refinements." She paused. "I need a fabrication partner who understands load tolerance and material behavior from a structural application standpoint." He waited. She said, "The work you've done here. The framing corrections. The ceiling joist notation. The way you read the composite specifications that first week." She said it carefully. "You have a structural understanding that most contractors don't have, and you understand the application side, how materials actually behave in a finished space." He said, "I'm a finished carpenter." She said, "You're a structural thinker who uses his hands." He looked at her. He thought about what she was actually asking, not just about work, about whether he was going to stay in the building. He said, "Tell me what you're thinking about the fabrication process." She turned. She went to her drafting table. She opened the blueprint tube and took out the drawings and spread them across the table, and for the first time she showed him all of them. Not just the patent applications, but the full research sequence, the development chronology, the material variations, the load testing protocol. He stood beside her at the table. He started asking questions. She started answering them. It was, he thought, the longest conversation they'd had. And also it wasn't conversation at all. It was work. Real work. The kind that required both of them to think in full and neither of them to hold anything back. That was October 28th. The work of building Crestline was different from the work of renovating the penthouse. The penthouse work had been his to lead. He'd had the expertise in the task, and she had watched and contributed and occasionally corrected. Crestline was different. He understood the structural application side and the fabrication process side. She understood the material science and the architecture of the innovation. The thing they were building together required both of them at the same level of the problem, and neither of them could arrive there without the other. He had not expected to find that kind of work. He had been good at his work, genuinely good, and he had loved it the way you loved something you were built for. But this was something else. This was the kind of work that made him feel that his full capacity was being used. He told her that once, early in the Crestline development, A Thursday evening when they'd been working through the fabrication specifications for the pilot batch, and she'd corrected his calculation on the bonding agent ratio, and then he'd corrected her assumption about the cure time, and she'd revised. And the revised version was right. He said, "I haven't had work that required this much from me before." She looked up from the specs. He said, "I mean at this level. The renovation, I was good at it. But I've been doing that for 12 years. This," she said, "this is new for both of us." He said, "You've been developing these materials for 12 years. She said, "Developing them alone." Or, with Marcus, which was its own, she stopped. She said, "I had a team. I had resources and a team and a partner who was genuinely invested, at least for the first decade." She looked at the specs between them on the table. "This is different." He said, "How?" She said, "You're not asking me what something is worth. You're asking me what it is." He held her gaze. She looked back at the specs. He kept working. In November, Wren came to the penthouse on a Saturday and found the east wing had been transformed by Sienna's worktable. She stood in the doorway and looked at it with the evaluating eye she'd been developing all October. She said, "It's better." Sienna said, "Yes." Wren said, "The light on the table from the northwest corner is different than the light from the main window. Is that intentional?" Sienna said, "Yes. I need a cooler light for reviewing prints and a warmer light for drafting. The northwest window gives the former. The diffused light from the main window gives the latter." Wren stood in the room, looking at the worktable, at the lights, at the arrangement. She said, "Can I draw in here on Saturdays?" Sienna said, "You've been drawing here for 4 Saturdays. Wren said, "But can I officially?" Sienna looked at her. Something moved in her expression that was not a smile but adjacent to one. She said, "Yes." Officially, Wren pulled out her notebook and sat on the floor in the corner she had claimed without asking anyone's permission back in October, and began to work. He and Sienna looked at each other over Wren's head. He said nothing. Neither did she. The day Wren asked what Sienna was to them was in December. He was making dinner, a complicated pasta that Wren had seen on a cooking show and had been campaigning for since September, which he had been putting off because it had 7 steps and required 30 minutes of uninterrupted attention. He had dedicated a Sunday to it. Sienna had come for the afternoon. She and Wren were in the living room, Wren explaining her light documentation project with the depth of someone who had been waiting for an audience with the right level of technical interest. He heard Wren say, "So by spring the triangle will be on the other side of the room completely." He heard Sienna say, "Northeast wall, yes, the angle reversal happens around the equinox." He heard Wren say, "That means I have to start a new documentation." He heard Sienna say, "You could look at it as one continuous documentation. The equinox is the inflection point." A pause. Wren, considering. Then Wren said, "Are you our person?" He stopped stirring. Sienna said, "What do you mean?" Wren said, "We have Grandma Betty. She's our person at family dinners and school plays and things. And we have Dad's friend Remy, who comes for holidays sometimes. And now we have you." She said it with the calm of someone reporting observable facts. "You know about light and buildings and you come to things." Sienna said, "I've come to the penthouse. And the showcase." Wren said, "But you're going to come to more things." It was not a question. Sienna was quiet. Wren said, "It's okay if you don't know yet. Dad didn't know yet for a while either." He heard Sienna's voice then, careful and precise, and something underneath it that wasn't careful or precise at all. She said, "I think I'm going to come to more things." Wren said, "Good." She said it with the particular finality of someone who has settled a question that needed settling. "Bring the good pencils. I need someone to check my notation on the East Wall series." He went back to the pasta. He stood at the stove and stirred and felt the particular fullness in his chest that had no name except that it was what he had. This was what he had. On October 31st, Wren came to the penthouse for the last Saturday of the finished renovation. She walked through the east wing with the notebook she'd been keeping and noted the angle of the light and wrote something Nate didn't see. At the end of the visit, she looked at Sienna. She said, "The room is better now." "Yes," Sienna said. Wren said, "Are we going to keep coming?" He looked at Sienna. Sienna looked at him. She said, "I think so." Yes, Wren considered this. She nodded once, with the gravity of someone settling something that had needed settling. "Good," she said. "I haven't finished mapping the light." She picked up her backpack. He caught Sienna's eye over Wren's head. There was something there, something that had been growing in the look she'd been giving him since the hallway conversation, since he'd said the only kind of stubbornness that works. Something that had no name yet, but was unmistakably present. He said to Sienna, "I'll call you about the fabrication specs." She said, "I know you will." He took Wren's hand, and they walked to the elevator. In the car, Wren said, "She's different than she was at the beginning." He said, "How do you mean?" Wren thought about it seriously, in the way she thought about everything. She said, "She's still. But it's not the same kind of still." He drove. He thought about that. He thought about two kinds of stillness, the kind that sealed things off, and the kind that had enough room for other things to be present. The Crestline Materials relaunch happened 6 months later. Not a launch event, a first signed contract, a fabrication partner, a pilot run of the composite material with an architecture firm in Seattle. Then 2 more contracts. Then 4. He was the fabrication consultant on the structural application side. The work suited him in a way that Finnish carpentry had always suited him, but hadn't fully required of him. The precision, the consequence, the particular satisfaction of making something that would be in buildings for 50 years. In the months between October and the first Crestline contracts, he had become something that had no clean job title. He came to the Penthouse, to the East Wing worktable, 4 days a week. He reviewed fabrication specifications and load testing protocols, and corrected the application assumptions that someone without field experience would have made wrong. He connected Sienna to suppliers he'd worked with for a decade, who understood structural materials better than the academic supply chain she'd been working through. He handled the physical prototyping for the first pilot batch in his workshop, in the space where Wren did her homework while he worked, and which now also contained a materials testing setup that Sienna had specified and he had built. He and Sienna had worked out the professional relationship carefully, in the way she worked out everything, with specificity, with clear terms, with the kind of clarity that comes from 2 people who had been in each other's presence long enough to know what the other one needed and what they couldn't provide. He invoiced her for his time. She responded with the kind of directness she applied to everything, correcting his billing when he underbilled himself, which she told him was a structural flaw in his professional character that she intended to address. He had started to tell her things. Not the things he told anyone, not the logistics of Wren's school or the work, but the things that came from the drawer he kept closed in himself. About Daniela. About the particular weight of caregiving and what it took out of you, and what it gave back that you hadn't expected. About the way Wren processed grief so differently from him, with a directness that made him feel both humbled and protected at once. She told him things in return. About her mother, about Marcus, which she said only once in the particular way that meant she'd decided to say the real version. That she had loved him, not romantically but genuinely, with the love you had for someone who'd built something hard alongside you for a decade, and that the betrayal was compounded by that, not lessened. The first real conversation about them was a Thursday evening in February, when the Crestline pilot contracts were signed and the Penthouse East Wing had become, by accretion, the working center of something that mattered. He had stayed late, which was not unusual anymore. They had been reviewing a third-party structural assessment of the pilot material, an architecture firm in Seattle that had agreed to review Crestline's specifications before committing to a supply relationship. The assessment was thorough and mostly favorable, with 3 technical corrections that Sienna had already identified and corrected before the report arrived. She had looked at the report with the expression she used when information confirmed what she already knew, but whose confirmation still cost something, a kind of restrained relief. She said, 3 corrections, all already addressed. He said, they missed the bonding agent revision. She said, they didn't have the revised spec. I sent the original batch specs before the correction. He said, should send the updated version. She said, I'll have it to them by morning. They were quiet for a moment. The East Wing held the good light still, even at this hour, Portland late February, the sky going dark, the river visible. The work spread across the table between them. He said, "I've been in love with you since about the ceiling joist." She went very still. He said, "That's not a thing I say easily or fast. I want you to know it was a long time coming." She said, "I know." She looked at him with the eyes that gave things back now, that had been giving things back since October, in amounts that grew. "I know you." He said, "Yes." She said, "I've been afraid of it." He said, "I know that too." She said, "Not because of you specifically. Because of," she gestured, including everything. "Because I sealed so much off, and what came back when I started to open it was more than I was expecting." He said, "What came back?" She said, "The work." Her. She gestured toward the light documentation Wren had pinned to the east wall. She said it quietly. "She walks in, and she treats you like the center of the room. She doesn't perform it. She just does it." He said, "She does that." Sienna said, "I wanted it to be safe, to be livable. I wanted to know that if I was in a room with you and it mattered, that it would still be there the next day." He said, "It will be." She said, "You can't promise that." He said, "I'm promising what I can promise." She looked at him. He said, "I showed up for 4 years, every day, for someone who needed me. I know what it means to show up." She said, "I know. I've seen you." He held her gaze. He didn't move toward her, because the distance wasn't something he should decide. She moved toward him. What happened next was quiet and unhurried, in the way of things that have been coming for a long time. The light in the east wing in February. The work spread across the table. The blueprint tube on the worktable, the cap off, the papers inside accessible. He put his hand on the side of her face, and she leaned into it slightly, the controlled, careful Sienna leaning into something, which was its own kind of evidence. He said her name. Just that. She closed her eyes. They stayed like that for a moment, not a resolution, but a beginning that knew itself for what it was. Outside, Portland was going about its February business, indifferent and lit. Inside the east wing, the light was good. He thought about the day he'd first seen the penthouse, the damaged ceiling, the warped floors, the woman at the drafting table who'd looked at him like he was the fourth contractor she was deciding whether to believe. He thought about staying. He thought about all the kinds of staying. He held her face in his hands and felt her breathing even out, and the thing that had been building since the ceiling joist settled into something with weight and permanence. Not an ending. A foundation. Those were different things. He knew the difference between them. The Crestline Materials case concluded in April with a full IP rights adjudication in Sienna's favor. Marcus Hale's contest was withdrawn 8 days before the final hearing, a settlement provision that his attorneys had apparently advised, and which was, Sienna told Nate, the most she would say about it, other than that it was over. She stood in the east wing the day she got the ruling, not at the worktable, just standing in the room, with the April light on the floor, looking at it. He let her have that. She said, "After a while I need to call my attorney." He said, "Call her." She called. She sat at the worktable and talked for 20 minutes, making notes, asking precise questions. When she hung up, she sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. He said, "How does it feel?" She said, "Strange." She said it honestly. "I've been building toward this for so long. I expected it to feel like something resolved. It feels like something starting." He said, "That's what one feels like." Usually, she looked at him. Then she said, "I'm going to need a lead application consultant for the Crestline commercial rollout. Someone who understands structural behavior from the fabrication side all the way to the installed application." He said, "I know." She said, "That's a significant commitment." He said, "I know that too." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Wren's school has a spring showcase next month." She mentioned it. He said, "She invited you?" Sienna said, "She told me the date. She said the light in the gymnasium was flat, but that she was doing a drawing project and she thought I would find it interesting." She said it the way Sienna said things now, with the warmth she was no longer entirely hiding. She seemed to assume I was coming. He said, "She usually does." She said, "Is that all right?" He said, "Yes." She said, "With you. I mean, is that all right with you?" He looked at her. At the person who had spent 7 months in a damaged penthouse building the case for something that was hers, who had said one morning quietly that she didn't know how to not seal things off, who had carried a blueprint tube to her desk instead of opening it for 6 more weeks because the possibility had to be protected first. He said, "Sienna?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to come to the showcase. I want Ren to show you her drawings. I want you to tell her when the angle is wrong and what it needs to be." He said it simply. "I want you in the room." She looked at him with the eyes that gave everything back now. She said, "I'll be there." Ren's showcase piece was a documentation project, 6 months of light studies in the penthouse, noon through 3, week by week. She had charted the shift, the angle, the quality. She had drawn each study in pencil, consistent scale, consistent hand. She had also, without telling either of them, included a drawn portrait of the East Wing worktable, Sienna's worktable, moved from the main room in November, with the note in the margin, "This is where the work happens." At the showcase, she stood beside her work and told the people who stopped to look about the angle of incidence and the way the light changed through the season and the relationship between the window orientation and the movement on the floor. Sienna stood beside her. She had come with Nate and Ren, arrived at the school in the particular way she arrived at things, precisely, fully present, without the social performance that some adults deployed in unfamiliar rooms. She had put on her good coat, which Nate had noticed she wore to things that mattered, and she carried a small notebook of her own, which Ren had seen immediately and had asked about with the focus of a scientist recognizing specialized equipment. "That's for notation," Ren said. "You're going to look at my work properly." Sienna said, "I always look at things properly." Ren said, "I know. That's why I told you about the showcase." She had taken Sienna's hand to lead her through the gymnasium, Sienna, who did not generally permit being led, and Sienna had led her. He had watched this and said nothing. At the display, a visitor stopped and looked at the documentation project and asked Ren about the location. Ren said, to one visitor who asked about the location, "My dad's job. He fixed the building and Sienna showed me where to watch." The visitor said, "Is Sienna your?" and then paused. Uncertain, Ren looked at Sienna. Sienna looked at Ren. Ren said, "She's ours." She said it with complete certainty, the way she said things that were simply true. She knows about light and buildings and she comes to everything. He was standing 6 feet away. He heard it. He watched Sienna receive it. He watched the controlled, careful Sienna receive something she had not been expecting, in the way she had received everything Ren offered, with a kind of fullness in her expression that had no management in it. She looked at him over Ren's head. He nodded once. Barely, she looked back at Ren's work. She said to Ren, "The angle notation in week 14 is slightly off. You can see it if you look at the relationship to the north window frame." Ren looked at it. She looked at the drawing. She looked at Sienna. She said, "I see it." She got out her notebook. "I'll fix it. She's ours." He held the thought for a moment, the way you held something to see if it had the right weight. It did. The following spring, the Crestline commercial rollout had contracts with 4 firms, a pilot distribution arrangement with a Northwest materials supplier, and a fabrication consultancy that occupied what had been Nate's single-person workshop and now employed 3 people, including him. The work was the hardest he'd ever done and the best work he'd ever done, and the specific way those 2 things could be the same thing. Sienna had moved her primary workspace to the penthouse east wing permanently. The worktable was hers. The large format printer was moved from the main room. The main room reverted to what it had been designed to be, a living space, which meant that when Ren came on Saturdays, and also increasingly on Fridays, and once on a Wednesday when school was out for a professional development day, there was somewhere for her to be that was not on a floor or in a corner. Ren had her chair. She had brought it from home one Saturday, with the casual ownership of someone who had long since decided where she belonged, and did not require the adults in the room to formally agree with her. He came for dinner on Tuesdays. Sienna came to his apartment on Thursdays when Wren had her activity, a drawing class that had replaced her science club when it turned out that drawing had more to teach her than the club did. The Thursday pattern had started because he had happened to be at the Penthouse late on a Thursday, and Sienna had said he should not drive home without eating and had assembled dinner without discussion. It had continued because it was good, and because Sienna had realized that good things, when you stop trying to manage them back to a safe distance, simply continued. She said this to him once, in March, standing in his kitchen while he made something with eggs, because it was late and he was tired. She said, "I've been practicing letting things continue." He looked at her. She said, "It's different from not fighting them. Fighting them is a decision. Letting them continue is," she considered it, "it's more like stopping the decision, allowing the thing to be what it is." He said, "How's that going?" She said, "Surprisingly well." She said it with the dry precision she used when something surprised her that she thought she should have seen coming. "I've been very good at decisions. I'm less practiced at permission." He set the pan on the stove. He looked at her at the kitchen counter in his apartment, in a room she'd been in 6 or 7 times now, and moved through with the ease of familiarity, and he felt the thing that had been accumulating since the ceiling joist. The quiet, enormous weight of something that was true and good, and had taken 2 people a specific set of losses to be able to receive. He said, "Wren said you were ours." She said, "I know. She heard it at the showcase." He said, "She was right." She said, "I know that too." He said, "Is that permission or a decision?" She looked at him. She said, "Both." She said it plainly. It's both. There is a version of this that calls it a rescue. The carpenter who fixed the damaged penthouse. The woman who could not let anyone stay. Neither of them would use that word. What Nate did when 4 other contractors had walked out and he stayed was not rescue. It was refusal. The refusal to treat her damage as the most interesting thing about her. The refusal to let a wrist sprain mean walking off a job he'd committed to. The refusal, every morning for 6 weeks, to be anything other than present. He had been asked, after the fact, what made him stay when the others had left. He gave the practical answer first. The money, the timeline, Wren's shoes. That was all true. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that he had walked into a damaged apartment and seen a woman in the middle of rebuilding something she had not decided to stop building. The plastic barrier and the stacks of papers and the large format printer humming against the wall and the blueprint tube standing in the hallway, these were not the signs of someone who had given up. They were the signs of someone who was fighting with whatever she had, in the only space left to her, on a timeline she couldn't fully control, with a wound she hadn't let anyone see. He recognized it. He had done that himself. For 2 years of Daniela's illness and the 14 months after, he had been building the thing he had to build. The life Wren needed. The presence she required. In the only space available, with whatever was left after the grief had taken what it took. He knew what it looked like from the inside. He knew it didn't look like giving up. So he stayed. What Sienna did in the months that followed was also refusal. The refusal to let Marcus Hale's reframing of her history become her history. The refusal to open the blueprint tube until she was ready. And then the refusal to leave it closed any longer. The refusal to stay sealed when Wren walked in with a notebook and documented her light. What Sienna was slow to understand, and then understood completely, was that she had been treating her own willingness to trust as a character flaw. The Marcus situation had arrived at a moment when her defenses were down, and had confirmed what her defenses had always been ready to confirm, that trust was a liability, that the person who let someone in was the person who got stripped of what mattered. She had sealed herself off, not out of coldness, but out of a very specific and very understandable fear. The fear was not wrong, exactly. It was just wrong about the conclusion. The conclusion she had drawn, that no one was safe to let stay, was not supported by the evidence. It was supported by the most painful piece of the evidence, the piece that happened at the worst possible time. But it was not the whole evidence. Nate was evidence. Wren was evidence. The blueprint tube open on the work table was evidence. There is a particular kind of courage that does not feel like courage when you are doing it. It feels like practicality. It feels like deciding to be reasonable about something instead of afraid. It doesn't feel brave. It feels like the next thing, the thing you do when the alternative has become unsustainable. Sienna had decided to be reasonable about the tube, about the conversation in the hallway, about Wren's Saturdays, which had accumulated into something neither of them had named until Wren named it herself, about Nate, who had stayed past every point where stopping would have been reasonable. It felt like practicality. It also changed everything. The penthouse was whole. The east wing had good light. The worktable had the northwest corner where the light was cooler and cleaner for reviewing prints, and the main window for drafting. The documentation on the wall, Wren's light studies, season by season, mapped the angle of incidents week by week, a record of a 7-year-old's sustained attention to something she'd found worth documenting. The blueprint tube was on the worktable, cap off, accessible. What it held was not a secret anymore. What it held was hers, and had been hers, and had survived the attempt to claim it otherwise. The documentation complete. The case won. The company relaunched. 3 things. Braided. The work she'd built and reclaimed, the belonging she'd let herself have, the record of a child who had kept coming back to check the angle of the light. He came every Tuesday for dinner. He was learning to cook more things, because Sienna was not interested in learning to cook, and Wren had strong preferences about which things were acceptable and which were experiments she was willing to tolerate. There was a running list. It included 7 items that were settled and 4 that were still under evaluation. She came every Friday. She had a key. He'd given it to her on a Thursday in February without making anything of it, because it was practical and she was there often enough that waiting for him to let her in was inefficient. She had taken it with the directness she applied to everything and had made no particular comment. But the following Friday, she'd arrived 20 minutes before he got home and had assembled dinner from what was in the kitchen, which was her version of flagging that she'd received it in the spirit intended. Wren had both things memorized. Sienna on Fridays, dinner on Tuesdays, Saturdays at the Penthouse, the showcase on the first Thursday of each month, because Wren had decided that Sienna needed to see her art class work regularly, and Sienna had agreed without condition. He watched his daughter navigate this with the particular confidence of a child who had known something before the adults said it out loud. She had not been surprised when things settled into what they were. She had been waiting for the adults to catch up. He thought about Daniela often, not with the complicated weight of the early months, but with the easy, specific grief of someone who had made room for grief alongside everything else. Daniela would have found Sienna interesting in the way she found precise people interesting, with genuine curiosity about how a mind that organized operated, with the specific pleasure she'd always had in people who said things directly. She would have liked Sienna's handwriting, which was small and exact. She would have liked that Sienna corrected Wren's notation and didn't apologize for it. She would have said, "You're allowed this." That was what she would have said. He believed it now more completely than he had when she'd first told him. Not because the time had lessened what she'd been, but because he understood better what allowed meant. It did not mean replacing. It did not mean forgetting. It meant continuing. In all the ways that being alive required continuing. It meant the Tuesday dinners and the Friday key, and the showcase on the first Thursday of each month. It meant what was happening, which was ordinary and specific, and his. Wren had her chair in the east wing. She had her notebook, all 6 of them now, the light documentation continuing across seasons. She had Sienna's corrections in the margins of certain pages, written in the small, precise handwriting that Wren had started practicing. She had the standing invitation to come to the Penthouse, and she exercised it regularly, with the ease of someone who had long since stopped needing to be invited. She had said once, on a Saturday in April watching Sienna work at the table with the northwest light on the prints, "I think she was always going to be here." He had said, "How do you mean?" Wren had said, "Like how the light was always going to come through the east windows. She just needed someone to notice." He had looked at his daughter for a long moment, at the 7-year-old who had walked into a damaged penthouse and documented the light and told a precise and guarded woman that she smelled like the good kind of wood. He said, "Yeah, that's about right." Wren had gone back to her notebook. He had gone back to the fabrication spec he was reviewing. Sienna had not looked up. But the corner of her mouth had moved, just slightly, in the way it moved, when something landed the way it was meant to. They had sat in the east wing in the April light, the three of them, doing the work that was theirs, in the room that had been made right, in the building that held them. This was what it was. Not a rescue. Not a found family in the easy sense. Just three people, in a room with good light, who had each come through something hard and had, in their different ways, refused to let the hard thing be the last word. The work continued. The light moved. The notebook filled. And the thing that had been sealed inside the damaged penthouse, the woman who had sealed herself off after losing everything, had turned out to be, exactly as documented, exactly as suspected, enough to rebuild on. More than enough. He had just refused to leave before she found it. That was the whole of the work. Refusal, present, sustained. He showed up. And eventually so did she. And then there were three of them, in a room with good light, and that was what they had, and it was everything.